The peaceful town of Riverdale was about to witness a storm like no other, when Officer Brad Jenkins, a man notorious for his unchecked power, violently assaults a pregnant black woman in broad daylight. He feels invincible, certain he'll escape the consequences once again. But as her quiet, unassuming father steps into the scene, the officer's world begins to unravel in ways he never imagined. Beneath the surface of a small-town mechanic lies a force more powerful than revenge, a lesson that will shatter everything Brad thought he knew about justice and humanity. It was a warm afternoon in the small town of Riverdale, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and the air was always quiet with the sounds of birds and the distant hum of cars. But beneath the peaceful surface, there was tension brewing. The relationship between the police and the minority communities had become strained over the past few years. People were growing fearful, whispering stories of unfair treatment and injustice. Today, those whispers would become a loud, painful reality for one young woman. Kendra Williams, a 23-year-old expecting mother, stepped out of the grocery store carrying a few bags of baby supplies. Her face was glowing, but she walked slowly, careful not to strain herself too much. She was 6 months pregnant and felt a soft kick from her baby as she made her way to the car. Everything in those bags was for her little one: tiny clothes, diapers, and soft blankets she'd picked out with love. As Kendra reached her car, Officer Brad Jenkins appeared out of nowhere, his shadow looming large over her. Brad was well known around town, not for being helpful, but for his rude and aggressive behavior, especially toward the black community. With his tall frame and piercing blue eyes, he always seemed to carry a storm wherever he went. "Hey, you." Brad's voice was sharp, and the sound of it made Kendra stop in her tracks. She turned, surprised to see the officer rushing toward her. "Yes," she replied, trying to stay calm. Brad's face was filled with anger as he pointed at her bags. "What do you think you're doing? You think you can just walk out of the store without paying?" Kendra's heart started pounding in her chest. "What? No, I paid for everything. I have the receipt right here," she said, fumbling with her purse to pull out the small piece of paper. But Brad wasn't interested in hearing her explanation. He snatched the bag out of her hands and rummaged through it, knocking some of the baby clothes onto the ground. His eyes narrowed as he glared at her. "Don't play dumb with me. I know your type. Always trying to steal something." Kendra's hands were shaking, but she kept her voice steady. "Please, officer, I'm pregnant. I haven't done anything wrong. I just want to go home." The crowd outside the store began to notice what was happening. A few people gathered, watching in silence, unsure whether to step in or walk away. But Brad's mind was set. His hatred, built on years of prejudice, boiled over. He stepped closer to Kendra, his face inches from hers. "You people always think you can get away with anything, don't you?" Tears welled up in Kendra's eyes. "I don't want any trouble. Please, just look at the receipt." But Brad wasn't listening. He didn't care about the truth. His anger consumed him, and without warning, he raised his fist and struck her hard in the stomach. The force of the punch made Kendra gasp in pain. She doubled over, clutching her belly, as a sharp, agonizing pain shot through her body. The world around her started spinning, and she collapsed to the ground. Her hands instinctively cradled her stomach, trying to protect her baby, her mind racing with fear. Was the baby okay? The crowd that had gathered outside the store was frozen, their mouths hanging open in shock. Some reached for their phones, recording the terrible scene unfolding before them, but none stepped forward. No one dared to challenge the officer. Kendra's vision blurred as tears streamed down her face. She looked up at Brad, who stood over her, breathing heavily. His face was twisted with rage, but for a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes. Was it regret? Fear? It didn't last. He quickly turned away, scanning the crowd with a menacing look, daring anyone to speak. Kendra's body shook as she lay on the hard pavement. Her heart raced with panic. She whispered softly to herself, her hands still holding her belly, "Please, baby, be okay." The minutes dragged on like hours. Her body ached, and the pain in her stomach was sharp and unrelenting. She could hear the murmurs of the crowd, the clicking of phones capturing the moment, but it all seemed far away. All she could think about was her baby. Finally, one brave woman in the crowd stepped forward, dialing for help. "Someone needs to call an ambulance," she shouted, her voice trembling with emotion. Kendra could barely hear her. Her world was fading in and out, the pain too much to bear. She closed her eyes, hoping that when she opened them again, this nightmare would be over. As sirens echoed in the distance, rushing toward the scene, the crowd remained in stunned silence. They had just witnessed something terrible, something that should never have happened. The hospital hallways buzzed with activity as nurses rushed back and forth, the sound of medical equipment beeping in the distance. In the emergency room, Kendra lay on a bed, pale and weak, her hand resting on her swollen belly. The pain had dulled, but the fear lingered. Was her baby okay? Kendra's mother, Anita, paced outside the room, her eyes swollen from crying. She clutched her phone tightly, waiting for the call she dreaded. It wasn't long before the sound of hurried footsteps filled the hallway, and her husband, Thomas, came into view. Thomas was a tall man, with graying hair and calm, steady eyes that always seemed to hold more than they revealed. He owned a small auto repair shop in town, where he spent most of his days quietly working with his hands. He was well known in Riverdale, but he preferred to keep a low profile, never drawing too much attention to himself, at least not until today. As soon as Thomas saw Anita, he rushed to her, pulling her into a tight embrace. His face remained calm, but there was an unmistakable tension in the way he held her. "How is she?" he asked quietly, though the fear was evident in his voice. "They're running tests, but we don't know yet. They said the baby seems okay for now, but they need to make sure," Anita replied, her voice breaking. "Thomas, they said an officer did this to her. Why would they do this to our baby?" Thomas didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved quickly to Kendra's side, pulling up a chair next to her bed. He took her hand in his thumb brushing softly over her knuckles. Kendra's eyes fluttered open, and she gave him a weak smile, though tears lingered at the corners of her eyes. "Dad," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I was so scared." Thomas leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I'm here now, sweetheart. You're safe." He stayed with her, holding her hand, his face betraying no emotion except for the quiet love he had for his daughter. But behind his eyes, something was brewing, something he had kept hidden for years. As he watched Kendra drift in and out of sleep, the raw anger that simmered beneath his calm surface began to rise. He had spent years controlling it, burying it, but seeing his daughter like this, it was almost too much. Meanwhile, across town, the police chief, Edward Langston, sat in his office, watching the footage from the grocery store incident. His fingers tapped nervously on his desk as he replayed the video, over and over, each time more uneasy than the last. Brad Jenkins had done it again. Chief Langston had received numerous complaints about Officer Jenkins before, but Brad had always seemed untouchable. He came from a family with deep connections, and every time he crossed the line, someone always managed to cover it up. But this time, something felt different. The brutality of what Brad had done, the fact that it had been caught on multiple cell phones, it wouldn't be as easy to sweep this under the rug. As the chief clicked through the files, one name popped up in the investigation notes: Thomas Williams. For a moment, Chief Langston stared at the name, and a chill ran down his spine. He knew that name. Everyone in law enforcement, at least those in the know, had heard it before. But why? What was it about Thomas Williams that suddenly made the chief feel like the ground beneath him was about to crumble? He quickly dialed a number on his phone, his hand trembling slightly. "We need to tread carefully with this one," he muttered into the receiver. "Thomas Williams. He's not just a mechanic." Back at the hospital, after hours of waiting, Thomas stepped out of Kendra's room. He pulled his phone from his pocket and walked to a quiet corner of the hallway. His calm demeanor hadn't faltered, but there was a noticeable shift in his posture. His jaw clenched as he dialed a number that hadn't been used in years. When the call connected, the voice on the other end was smooth, professional. "Thomas, it's been a long time. I wondered if you'd ever need to make this call." "I need a favor," Thomas said, his voice low but firm. "It's about my daughter." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Is this about what happened today?" Thomas' eyes darkened. "Yes, and it's time we remind the people in this town who I really am." The voice on the other end gave a slight chuckle. "Consider it done. I'll make sure the right people get involved. You just let me know how far you want this to go." Thomas didn't hesitate. Far enough to make sure it never happens again. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, his face still calm, though his mind was racing with thoughts of justice. The quiet, small-town mechanic was gone, replaced by a man who carried secrets far heavier than anyone could have imagined. In his home that evening, Brad Jenkins sat in front of his television, barely paying attention to the news. He felt confident, as he always did after these incidents. He'd done worse and gotten away with it. Why would this time be any different? He had powerful connections, and he was used to people looking the other way. But as the night wore on, he began to feel a strange unease. His phone buzzed with messages, whispers about the investigation, something about Thomas Williams, but Brad wasn't concerned. He knew how these things worked. Yet, as the minutes ticked by, he couldn't shake the growing feeling that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. In the stillness of the night, Thomas stood by Kendra's hospital bed, watching her sleep peacefully for the first time in hours. His face was unreadable, but deep inside, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let this go. Brad Jenkins had always felt invincible. He'd spent years patrolling the streets of Riverdale, throwing his weight around, harassing whoever he wanted, and getting away with it. To him, the badge was a shield, protecting him from any consequences. No matter how many complaints were filed against him, no matter how many people he hurt, he always emerged unscathed. This time, he was sure it would be the same. But then, things started to go wrong. It began with small annoyances. One morning, Brad walked out to his car to find it covered in scratches, deep grooves running along the sides, as if someone had taken a key to it in the dead of night. A childish prank, he thought, shrugging it off as he got into his car. The next day, however, things escalated. An anonymous letter appeared in his mailbox. No address, no name, just a few chilling words scrawled in shaky handwriting. "You'll pay for what you did to her." Brad crumpled the note in his hand, his face turning red with anger. He told himself it was just empty threats. People always talked, but no one ever did anything. That's how it had always been. But the threats didn't stop. Every few days, another letter would show up, sometimes warning him to watch his back, other times listing disturbing details about his life, where he lived, what his wife's name was, even where he went to get his morning coffee. It wasn't long before the tension started creeping into his bones. He could brush off the scratches, the letters, but something about all this felt different, something he couldn't control. Then came the suspension. Brad stormed into the police station one morning, fully expecting to clock in and start his day like usual. But as soon as he stepped through the doors, he noticed the shift in the air. Officers who used to greet him with nods or smirks now avoided his gaze. Some whispered among themselves. Brad's stomach ached as he marched toward the chief's office, forcing himself to stay calm. When he entered the office, Chief Langston didn't even look up from his desk. "Jenkins," he said quietly, pushing a folder across the desk without meeting Brad's eyes. You're being suspended, pending the investigation." Brad's jaw tightened. Suspended? For what? That girl. That girl's father is not someone we can mess with. The chief cut him off, his voice low and strained. There's heat coming from all directions. Media, public, even politicians. We can't protect you this time. Not with the footage, not with the witnesses, not with Thomas Williams breathing down our necks. Brad frowned, the name Thomas Williams hanging heavily in the air. Who is he? Why is everyone acting like he's some kind of god? The chief finally looked up, his face pale. You really don't know, do you? Thomas Williams isn't just a mechanic. He's a retired federal officer. He used to lead major operations across the country, working with law enforcement, the FBI, and even political figures. His connections run deep, very deep. Brad's heart began to race. The full weight of the situation started to sink in. What are you saying? I'm saying, the chief replied slowly, you've picked a fight with the wrong man. Williams may look like just another guy fixing cars in town, but he has the power to make your life a living nightmare. And from what I'm hearing, he's already started. Brad left the office feeling sick to his stomach. It was all beginning to unravel, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to stop it. His once rock-solid confidence began to crumble as he realized that this time, he might not be able to bully his way out of the mess he created. That night, Brad sat at his kitchen table, staring blankly at the stack of anonymous letters piled up before him. His wife, Claire, stood across the room, her arms crossed, a worried look on her face. You need to do something about this, she said quietly. People are talking, Brad. The neighbors are whispering, and I've heard reporters are asking questions. What are we going to do? Brad clenched his fists. I didn't do anything wrong. She was resisting. She was pregnant, Brad. Claire snapped, her voice shaking with anger. You punched a pregnant woman, and now her father is coming after us. Brad didn't have an answer. He didn't even know what to think anymore. He had been so sure, so convinced that he was untouchable. But now, with his job on the line, his car vandalized, and his reputation falling apart, fear gripped him in a way he had never experienced before. He felt powerless, and he hated it. The next day, Brad made the decision to confront Thomas. He wasn't sure what he expected, but he needed answers, needed to know why this man, this quiet mechanic, was turning his life upside down. Brad drove to the small auto shop on the edge of town, his heart pounding in his chest. He had prepared himself to intimidate Thomas, to throw his weight around like he always did. But when he stepped inside the garage and saw Thomas standing there, wiping grease from his hands, everything Brad had rehearsed fell away. Thomas looked up slowly, his eyes locking onto Brad's with a calm intensity that unnerved him. There was no anger in Thomas' face, no fury or rage, just quiet, steady control. Brad swallowed hard, feeling the words dry up in his throat. Why are you doing this? He finally managed to ask. Thomas took a slow step forward, his voice calm but cold. My daughter deserved justice. And you deserve to live with the consequences of your actions. Brad's hands trembled. I didn't mean to. Thomas raised a hand, silencing him. You did. You always do. You thought no one would ever stand up to you, but you underestimated the wrong man. Brad stood there, frozen, as Thomas turned away, and calmly went back to his work, as if their conversation had never happened. It was in that moment, standing in that quiet garage, that Brad realized just how far out of his depth he was. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with reporters, concerned citizens, and the curious who had followed the case since the beginning. The once confident and arrogant Brad Jenkins now sat at the defendant's table, looking far from the powerful officer he used to be. His uniform had been replaced by a cheap suit, and his hands fidgeted nervously as he waited for the judge to enter. In the months following the incident, Brad's world had crumbled. He had been fired from the police force force, his reputation shattered beyond repair. What had once been quiet whispers in town became loud, unforgiving outrage. His face was plastered on every news channel, and the footage of him striking Kendra was replayed over and over again, a painful reminder of the violence and hatred he had allowed to consume him. Even his closest friends had distanced themselves, leaving him isolated and ashamed. Now, he faced criminal charges for assault. The media had painted him as a symbol of systemic racism, and there was no escaping it. People protested outside the courthouse, chanting for justice. Brad had never felt so small, so utterly alone. The sound of the gavel brought the room to silence as the judge entered and took his seat. Everyone's eyes turned toward the front of the room as the proceedings began. Thomas Williams sat in the front row, calm and composed as always. Kendra was beside him, her belly much bigger now as she neared the end of her pregnancy. She looked peaceful, healed from the trauma that had nearly taken everything from her, but it was clear from the way she held her father's hand that the scars ran deep. Brad kept stealing glances at Thomas, trying to read the man who had turned his life upside down. He expected hatred, fury, some form of vengeance, but Thomas had been eerily quiet throughout the trial, never once losing his temper or showing the anger Brad thought he deserved. That silence haunted him. What was Thomas planning? Why wasn't he doing more to destroy Brad completely? As the prosecution wrapped up its case, the room fell into a heavy silence. Everyone waited, expecting harsh words, a demand for severe punishment. But when the judge asked Thomas if he wanted to make a statement, the entire courtroom leaned in, eager to hear what the father of the victim would say. Thomas stood slowly, his tall frame commanding attention without effort. He walked to the front, facing the judge, but his eyes drifted toward Brad. When he spoke, his voice was steady and clear, carrying a weight that quieted even the murmurs in the back of the room. "Your Honor," Thomas began, "I stand here today not just as Kendra's father, but as someone who has seen the worst and best of humanity throughout my life. What happened to my daughter was wrong. It was cruel, and it nearly took away the most precious gift in our family, her unborn child. Brad Jenkins' actions were inexcusable." Brad felt his stomach drop. This was it. This was where Thomas would ask for the maximum sentence, where he would finish what he had started. Brad braced himself. "But," Thomas continued, his voice softening, "I do not stand here to ask for vengeance." The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Brad blinked, his heart pounding in his chest. Did he hear that right? "I believe in justice," Thomas said, looking directly at Brad now. "But I also believe in the power of change. Brad Jenkins hurt my daughter, and for that, he must face the consequences. But I do not believe that locking him away will solve the deeper issue we face. Racism, hatred, and violence. They are learned behaviors. They come from fear, ignorance, and anger, and they can be unlearned." A murmur swept through the courtroom as people exchanged confused glances. Even the judge raised an eyebrow, curious about where this was going. "My daughter deserves peace," Thomas said, "and I believe Brad deserves a chance to understand the depth of the harm he has caused, not just to Kendra, but to our entire community. That is why I am asking for something different." The judge nodded for him to continue. "I am asking that Brad Jenkins be sentenced to community service," Thomas said firmly, "but not just any service. I want him to work under a program that I will oversee, where he will serve and interact with the very people he has hurt for years. I want him to hear their stories, see their struggles, and face the pain he has caused head-on. That, I believe, is the only way he can truly learn what justice and humanity mean." The room erupted in whispers. This was not the outcome anyone had expected. Brad, too, was stunned. He sat frozen in his chair, his mind struggling to process the words. Community service? Under Thomas? How could this be happening? The judge called for order, then leaned forward. "Mr. Williams, are you sure about this? You could request a much harsher sentence." Thomas nodded. "I am sure, Your Honor. This is not about revenge. This is about change." The judge considered for a moment, then nodded. "Very well. In light of the circumstances and the request from the victim's family, the court will sentence Mr. Jenkins to a year of community service under Mr. Williams' supervision." Court adjourned. A week later, Brad stood outside a community center, a sense of dread washing over him. His once pristine life had been reduced to this. As he entered, the first person to greet him was Thomas, who handed him a list of tasks for the day. The work was hard, and the people he met were those he had ignored or mistreated for years. Slowly, as the weeks passed, Brad's walls began to crack. He heard their stories, saw the pain he had caused, and for the first time, he began to understand. Each day was a lesson, a mirror held up to his past, forcing him to confront the reality of his actions. And through it all, Thomas remained calm, patient. Not a word of anger, not a single moment of revenge, just quiet guidance. Slowly, Brad's heart began to change. From a distance, Kendra watched as the man who had once harmed her learned the most powerful lesson of all: compassion. And as she cradled her newborn baby in her arms, she knew that her father's approach had done something no prison sentence ever could. He had planted the seeds of redemption. And for the first time in a long while, justice didn't feel so far away. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel for more video.